Welcome back, and we're going to continue our second part of our video lecture on the family and adolescent psychology. In this lecture, we're going to focus on two broad topics. The first one is adolescent-parent conflict, and the second one is the varieties of different parenting styles and how these various parenting styles impact and influence adolescents as they make the transition from children into adults. So let's begin talking about something we've sort of mentioned before, this idea of parent-adolescent conflict. And this is very associated with two people, Stanley Hall, who's an anthropologist, and Anna Freud, who was a daughter of Sigmund Freud, famous founder of psychology. And if you've ever heard of terms like Freudian slip, or the idea of interpreting the genes and blaming your mother for everything that's wrong with you, or the words superego, ego, and id, those are all coming from a Freudian tradition. And a lot of this, because Freudian psychology is very much about child rearing and very much about parental conflict with children, this idea of parent-adolescent conflict was kind of taken for granted as a universal phenomenon, is that all adolescents will eventually rebel against all parents, and adolescents will experience intense conflict for many years. And the idea here is that every child wants to become their parent. So little boys want to become their fathers, little girls want to become their mothers. As they become older, they become competitors with their parents and other adults who might be parental figures. And this leads to adolescent rebellion and then adolescent conflict. Generally, the idea that adolescents will reject and rebel against parental authority and eventually replace it with their own set of values as a rising generation. This was, for most of the 20th century, the mid-20th century, this was taken for granted. It was thought to be universal, which meant it across all different cultures and all different traditions, and it's something that everyone would go through, perhaps maybe at a different stage. So how accurate are these early theories? The short thing is not very accurate at all. Some of this is because why is there a generation gap? Why is there conflict? Part of it is because I think in the 1960s particularly, where you saw a lot of student protests and student uprisings against the Vietnam War and the peace movement and various different liberation movements, the civil rights movement, and not just in the United States, but all around the world in the late 1960s, the way that people interpreted this historical phenomenon was that this is just an example of the universal phenomenon of children rebelling against parental authority, and in some ways that was discounting and saying, like, your issues are not real, they're just, disagreeable, irritable teenagers who don't like authority. However, what also happened this time, and I sort of alluded to this in the previous lecture, is that as people had smaller families and fewer children, some parents spent a lot more time trying to figure out how to be good parents, which means you had baby books like Dr. Spock, and you had people looking for advice on how to raise your children better, rather than saying, look, if I have 10 children, one of them is going to turn out okay. And so what a lot of people read this from Freud and from Stanley Hall and said, okay, there's going to be this conflict. And part of this is like, if you are looking for something, you're going to find it. And what that means is that if you think your children are going to rebel, it becomes a little bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. And not surprisingly, if you expect them to rebel, they are going to rebel. And this is consistent with other findings in social psychology, that if you think a student has capabilities, a student generally rises to your expectations, and if you have low expectations of students, they tend to lower themselves to that expectations. And just like for teachers and students, for parents and their children, if you expect something to happen, you might actually, in a sense, make it more likely to happen. What does the research indicate? The first one is that there's not a lot of emotional distance between teens and parents. It means teenagers don't seem to hate, I'm sure there are teenagers who hate some parents, but there is not, let's say, a general phenomenon where teenagers are alien or disliking of older people or things of that sort. What they have, particularly on core beliefs, so like on roles of religion and ethics and politics and all those types of things, there's generally seems an agreement. Your parents do socialize you to be like them, whether you become more like them or that you kind of develop in a reaction to them, which means you might reject their values, but you're still kind of using the same moral language in describing things, which means like you both might have different ideas about freedom, but you still are using the word freedom to describe like what's important to you. So the point is that when people actually went and studied this, and they kind of left the idea of general theories and narratives, like they didn't find very much of a conflict there. The other part to this is that, you know, the coming of age story in fiction and kind of the idea of parental versus teenager conflict makes for a great story, right? If you have a family and everyone is hating on each other and everyone has conflicts and secrets from each other, this makes for a very good novel or short story. And so I think what partly is that people, reality was imitating art, and as people were telling these stories, people took them to be true, and people took them to be real, and therefore this influenced people's perceptions, which then influenced the development of this idea of a generation gap. Where the generation gap exists is you might call personal taste, which means how people dress. So this, you know, stereotypically long hair versus short hair, facial hair versus being shaved, how high your dress should or shouldn't be, music preferences, jazz versus rock and roll, leisure activities, going to a movie, dancing, listening to a radio, watching TV. And these are relatively minor things. You might say they're mostly cosmetic, but they don't seem to reflect fundamental conflict between teenagers and parents. So few scholars really take this idea of parent-adolescent conflict as a defining aspect of adolescence that seriously anymore. That doesn't mean like the idea of having the parents in their midlife crisis and the adolescents reaching adulthood at the same time doesn't matter. It still raises issues and still how people view themselves, but it's not like this fundamental universal conflict that it was portrayed to be in previous decades. So in the 1960s, this stereotype of storm and stress of adolescence and like the troubled teenager who's trying to find themselves and is you know, inventing themselves, found that, as I said before, most adolescents trust their parents, admire their parents, like their parents. It's not really discontinuous with what's happening in childhood. If you liked your parents when you were young, you probably like your parents when you were older. If you disliked them when you were younger, you dislike when they're older. But that was more on a case-by-case basis than a general phenomenon. And as I said, the disagreements were minor issues, closed when curfew should be set and things of that sort. But let's still take this seriously and talk about what this conflict in adolescence is. Conflict with parents increases sharply in early adolescence, which means early adolescence means middle school years, and this is kind of the years where you might start making choices about your own dress, you might start having some type of employment or income, you might start engaging in peer group activities and less with the family unit, and we saw that kind of at the end of the last video lecture. And it is particularly, to the extent that it happens, it's more frequent between mothers and daughters than between other parent-children pairs. It's only in late adolescence, meaning the end of high school, early college, that the conflict with parents diminishes substantially. A lot of this is that, you know, people feel more settled. You might say the early adolescence disagreements happen to do with hormones and dealing with sexuality and dealing with a lot of other things, entering the workforce. And by late adolescence or, you know, the emerging adulthood, proto-adulthood period, more or less you do see the conflict disappear. So why are these early adolescents, you're seeing these conflicts? The first one, as I was kind of alluding to, is biological changes. Adolescents are bigger and stronger, which means, you know, when you're only 4 feet high and your parents are around 5 to 6 feet high, physically there's no threat and your parents can just pick you up and move you if you become disagreeable. As you become physically about equals, there can be more of a physical challenge as part of the conflict. There can also be the fact that parents are losing some of their strength at the same period, and so these biological changes are bringing them into more equality. Also cognitive changes that people can have better judgment, better reasoning power, better ability to think abstractly, and that means they can argue better and they win more arguments. And when you think you can win an argument, you tend to have more arguments because the possibility that you can win those arguments makes you more likely to get into conflict and arguments. If you think like, I still disagree, but I know I'm not going to win, you just might say, look, you know what, there's nothing to be gained from arguing this point. And you might see that for younger children who might have issues with their parents or early adolescents. But around this time, and speaking as a teacher, most teenagers this age think that they're smarter, they know more than their parents, they're better informed. And as I kind of alluded to in the previous video lecture, a lot of them are more likely to use their peers as a reference group than their parents, which means if their peers tell them something and their parents tell them something, they're more likely to believe their peers and their parents, despite, you might say, the abstract logical position is that your parents are probably more intelligent, better informed, and have more life experience. Children tend to identify with their reference group more. And so these changes are also part of that. Once again, just repeating, it's mundane issues, not big issues. It's not fundamentally like how you should live or whether you're religious or not religious or big political issues about justice. It's things like, what should you do with your free time? Are you going to, go with your family to an event, or are you going to go do something with your friends? How clean is a clean room? How often should you bathe? What clothes you should wear? And I think a lot of this happens that it's a transition from the parents making most of these decisions, or if not all these decisions, to that some of these decisions are being made by the teenagers and the adolescents, and as a result, there's going to be some conflict, but this is not, let's say, fundamental conflict. So part of it is just kind of how they frame issues. When parents tend to deal with these differences, they tend to frame things in terms of right and wrong, big morality, social convention. So I mentioned in class that one of my uncles basically thought that my brother was an immoral person because he wore a black heavy metal t-shirt. And he says, look, I just like the band, I like their music, I don't really listen or read their lyrics or take it seriously. But an adult might see this as a big dramatic conflict. Differences on substance abuse, difference on drinking. The adult are more likely to portray these as black and white issues, while teens seem like, hey, a little substance abuse is not a bad thing. I see adults doing it, or one drink is not going to kill you. While parents are saying like you can't have just one drink. You're either a drunk or you're a good kid. So teens are more likely to see things as a matter of personal choice, and you can kind of see this in terms of like my own experience about how sometimes teenagers talk about sexuality. Adults might see homosexuality as a matter of a moral issue, while a teenager might say, look, I don't have that inclination, I don't agree with it, but hey, if someone else wants to do it, that's a matter of their personal choice. If they want to dress that way, that's okay, whatever floats their boat, which means they're more likely to portray it as a contextual thing or as a matter of personal values and choices. At least in the American suburban teenage milieu, you'd see that being the case. So the point is that when one party is seeing it as a big dramatic issue that's black and white, and the other issue sees lots of shades of gray, you're more likely to not agree, because even if you are on the same side of an issue, how much weight you put on it is going to be different. So this conflict is not universal and natural. A lot of this has to do with culture. Different cultures have different roles for adolescents versus adults. And depending how cultures define these roles, there can be more or less conflict. So the biological and cognitive changes that I discussed earlier are happening to all adolescents across the world in every place, but you're not seeing adolescent conflict in all cultures, indicating that it's not natural, it's not biological, it's not universal in the development process. It has a lot more to do with what roles society is putting different people into and whether those imply conflict or not. So culture is going to take the raw materials of what people are doing, right? Everyone's going to be young at some time. Everyone is going to become an adult. Everyone has hormonal changes during this period. But culture is going to shape them in different ways. And so I kind of talked about my own experience with like maturity in high school and college in Japan versus the United States. While Japanese students are very mature for high school students if they were American high school students, but they're really, really like lazy college students compared to American college students. A lot of that is because the Japanese see high school as a time to work hard and college is a time to explore and develop yourself and sow your wild oats. The Americans tend to be more tolerant of doing that in your middle school and high school years, but when you graduate from high school, you're supposed to get serious about your occupation and learning and all those things. And that's a cultural definition, not a biological or physiological necessity. So in traditional cultures, it's rare to see parents and adolescents have these kind of small mundane conflicts that you see, let's say, in American culture. And there's one reason for this. As we mentioned before, In a traditional culture, it's going to be largely agricultural. Your parent is not just your parent, your biological parent. Your parent is probably also your employer. And so you kind of have a mutual interdependence. You're going to have to depend upon other people, so you're not going to sweat small details because you realize that's not really good for business or for the economic welfare of the family unit. There's also might be a more, let's say, accepting of parental authority, and there's a Dutch psychologist named Gert Hofstede has looked about that some cultures have more of a tolerance for hierarchy than others, which means that Asian cultures, Latin cultures, tend to be very much hierarchical and very vertical in their organization, but there's an acceptance of that's okay, and they also might pair parental authority with a parental responsibility to take care of children that's even greater than you might experience in American culture. So the reason the conflicts don't happen is that it is socialized that it's good to listen to your superiors, meaning people who are older than you, people that are higher status than you, even when they're wrong. It shows kind of what you might call filial piety, if you're thinking in terms of Confucian values, that independent of what your parents demand of you, it's good to follow what your parents tell you to do, even if it's wrong. It shows maybe perhaps a generosity of spirit that you are tolerating your parents in their mistakes. But there might be some emotional distance between teens and parents. We're not finding as much as, let's say, this big parental conflict that Freudian psychologists emphasized in an earlier time. Most teens feel close to their parents. They respect their parents' judgment. They feel loved by their parents and respect their parents as individuals. Now, this is not saying that there are not issues. There are obviously a lot of teenagers who have significant, substantial, and frankly well-grounded dislikes, conflicts, disagreements with their parents. As a teacher, I've encountered really great parents that are models to everyone, and happy children. I've also encountered a lot of situations where, clearly the family is dysfunctional, and things are not working well. Sometimes this can be because of abuse or economic situation in the household. Sometimes it's just people are not mature enough, and people make mistakes. But what I think is striking is that the biggest complaint that teenagers and adolescents seem to have when you ask surveys and ask them about what they would like more from their parents is that they would like to have more time from their parents. They feel their parents are more distant. If anything, the biggest concern is that not that they want their parents out of their lives, is that they want their parents more involved. And showing a graph that I showed you in the last video lecture is that the percent of your waking hours that you are spending with your family groups, parents, mother, full family group, mother, father, clearly takes some declines going from elementary school to the middle school years, and then from early high school to late high school. And as someone who kind of is a high school teacher and is taught in middle school, the level of parents coming to freshman year parent-teacher conferences is near 100%, while parents of seniors rarely ever come. And I think that indicates that there is either a conscious stepping back, or that teens are more likely to identify with their peer groups, and maybe not even communicate as much with their parents as they did previously. So typically what happens if you have a problem with your parent, if there's a conflict between teenagers and adults, it improves once the young person leaves the home. And a lot of that is because when you stop living together, all these mundane issues that people are having conflict over are going to improve, right? You're not worried about curfews. You're not worried about how messy your room is. You're not worried about who's paying what, because those are independent decisions and you're not, let's say, having to make them collectively. What happens very often is that, and I think many teenagers and many of my former students would say this, is that they understand their parents more when they leave home, and they understand some of the pressures that parents feel and the cost of different types of things, and perhaps that their judgment is improving and they're understanding the advice their parents were trying to give to them. So those who moved at least an hour away, so the ones that created at least some distance between where they lived after high school graduation or maybe college, their parents actually felt closer to their parents. I see this children who go far away for college, like maybe the University of Buffalo or maybe even SUNY Albany, tend to be happier with their parents than the ones who live at home and go to college and commute, mostly because there's ongoing conflicts. Most college students, even if they're living at home, feel like they need to be treated like an adult and have privacy and have, a say in how things are done. And parents might not be at that point yet or agree with that. Also, distance seems to make you value your parents' opinion most highly. Perhaps they're better in small doses. And those who remain at home tend to have the worst relationships with their parents in those respects. So now we're going to move on to talking about parenting styles. And so we're kind of like finished talking about parental adolescent conflict. And generally there are two dimensions that Baumrind classifies parenting styles. The first one is responsiveness, which you might say is, are parents warm or cool, which means emotionally warm. Are they ones that say, look, shower you with love and support and, express this openly and directly to their children? Or there's someone that are more reserved and aloof. So do they actually address children's needs in an accepting and supportive manner, as opposed to, let's say, a distant and maybe a judgmental manner? So that's kind of the warmth dimension. The second one is demandingness, which means, do parents set criteria or standards that their children are expected to live up to? Which means it's one thing to say, hey, I love you, I support you, and I don't really care what you do. Many people say like the worst thing that is like when people, the worst situation to be in is when people stop criticizing you, because when people stop criticizing you, it's kind of indicating they don't care anymore. They've given up on you. And demandingness is kind of this idea that you're going to demand, a certain level of behavior, right? You are going to study for school. I want you to be the best. I want you to be successful. I want you to use your time. And so you might think of this as like unconditional love and also earned love. And the way that it was described to me, and I don't necessarily agree with these terms, but I think they might be illustrative here, is what they call mommy love and daddy love. Your mother loves you no matter what you do. You could be a horrible person, criminal, you could mess up your life, your mother still loves you. And that's the unconditional love, the warmth dimension, while your father is more about earned love. Like, your father can always tell you how you could do something better, tends to be critical. The idea that you have to kind of prove that you're worthy of their affection. And that's kind of the idea of daddy love, which is that it has to be earned. You have to do something to require it. In fact, unconditional love sometimes feels bad because you don't feel like it has anything to do with you. It has everything to do with them, because even if you make all the mistakes, you get the same reaction from your parents. So this is the degree to which parents expect and demand mature, responsible behavior. And that parental monitoring, which means they're monitoring your progress, versus kind of like your parents are in your head, kind of a psychological control. Okay, so out of these two dimensions, you can create kind of 4 different parenting styles. So you can have high demandingness, high responsiveness, low demandingness, low responsiveness, high demandingness, low responsiveness, and low demandingness and high responsiveness. And if that wasn't clear, if I said that through, basically I just described on the 2 dimensions how the 4 types are created, which are authoritative, indulgent, authoritarian, and indifferent. I think for the most part these are self-explanatory, except for authoritative versus authoritarian, and we'll get a little more to that as we go further talking about parenting styles. So authoritative parent is someone who's warm. That means basically like, hey, I'm on your side, I'm in your cheering section, but I'm going to push you. And you can think of this as a coach that might, let's say, goes out, says, look, keep practicing, you got to be tough, keep trying, work harder. But when you do and you're successful, gives you the first big hug and says, great, I'm so proud of you. And instead of taking, let's say, credit for your successes, basically says, look, you did this all, I'm so proud of you, but kind of in the same way, pushed you to get the most out of your ability or out of your talent and interest. Another part of this is that they're giving, authoritative parents want the child to choose the right thing rather than be forced to it. So they're going to be more likely to try to say, look, this is the reason why we have this rule. This is the reason why I have to do this. This is the reason. So the point is they try to legitimize their authority by explaining it and making it rational, while an authoritarian parent might only point to the fact that there's a difference in power and because of the difference in power, demand obedience, demand conformity with their rules or their standards. I.e., so an authoritative parent wants the child, the teenager, to accept the standards being set in front of them, while the authoritarian parent is going to force the child to accept those standards. Obviously, if something gets forced on you, you're more likely maybe to reject it because of the manner it's delivered. An indulgent parent is the one that says, hey, you get everything you want. You want the keys to a new car, you crash your car 3 times, that's okay, we'll get you another car. You want to have a big party, you want to have, basically is just indulgent. And I think we all know someone who has parents like this, perhaps ourselves, but they don't really seem to be like saying, okay, with all this support, what are you supposed to do with it? They don't seem to expect it much. And I have cousins who grew up in a lot of affluence, and they had everything that money could buy, but they were not really successful. And I've seen this when I've taught in sometimes in affluent school districts, is that the kids are relatively well supported. They have the resources they need, but they don't seem as ambitious. They don't seem as hungry, and I think that's partly because the parents maybe are not pushing them as much. And maybe this comes from the idea that hey, we were pushed, that's how we were successful and affluent, and we're not going to do that with our children. So they might be doing the opposite of what their parents did to them. So maybe an indulgent parent is a product of an authoritarian grandparent. And lastly, indifferent parents, and these are maybe the worst type of parents because they don't provide the support and they kind of let the children do whatever they want. So let's look a little closer on this and what you might hear from a typical parent. So an authoritarian parent might say, do it my way because I said so. Don't argue with me. It's my house and my rules. I'm sure all of us have heard this from one of our parents at least once in our lives. Just because they say my house, my rules does not make them more authoritarian. What makes them authoritarian is that is the response for every single interaction with their children, their teenage children, which is that they don't try to explain the rules. They don't say why this is a rule is a good thing. They just point out that I have the power. You don't have a say in this, and my house, my rules, and if you don't like it, you can go somewhere else. Well, an authoritarian parent might try to negotiate or explain or to compromise and bargain with the child, which means, so it might be something, no, we can't go to the mall. Okay, so they're basically saying this is a rule. Then they're going to say, they're going to legitimize it, give the reason, because we have, as a family, have made a plan to see your sick aunt, right? I'm telling you why we're doing this. I'm not saying it's because I said so. But let me meet you halfway. After we go see your sick aunt, we'll drop you off at your friend's house on the way home and say, hey, do you want to accept that as a good compromise? And basically they're trying to elicit the idea that, hey, you understand why I'm doing this and I want you to be part of it, so I want you to have buy-in on it. And that might be something that an authoritarian parent would kind of approach the same conflict. An indifferent parent, mom, you're home, mom. And there's times where I think parents, particularly who are very busy and very stressed and anxious or have other issues, adults have problems and issues in their life, basically the children become the parent. And I've seen situations where teenagers have told their parents, and you've seen a reversal where the parent seems to be the child and the child seems to be more like the parent. And basically the parent does not seem to be parental. There's kind of an absence of authority. And as a result, and you might think this makes the child more mature, but I think what happens is that the child doesn't have a good model to basically base their adult self on. While an indulgent parent might just say, anything you want. I think this is more of something that exists in teenage movies and literature. I've never really seen someone say this clearly oh, have a party in the house. Here's the liquor cabinet, and here's a gun, the lock to the gun safe, and all this stuff is. I don't think. I mean, perhaps there are parents that are that way, but I think this is a parent. I don't think. I mean, a parent like this probably should be. I don't know. I would be disappointed if I was this parent. Let me leave it at that. But I think there are parents that are kind of indulgent, and you might see this often in cases of divorce, where one parent might try to curry favor with a child by, let's say, giving them the thing the other parent is saying you can't have. And so sometimes you get, it's not so much that you have an indulgent parent, it's that you might have one indulgent parent and one parent who's more authoritarian. And this can lead to conflict among the parents about how to raise their children, and therefore what teenage children learn is that they can manipulate that. And I think if you learn that the way of adults is to manipulate them, that's not a good model to base your own adult self on. So just a little bit more. Authoritative parents link their demands to positive outcomes, like if you do what I say, you're going to do better in school. If you do what I say, you're going to do better at this activity, which means they try to say, look, I'm not saying this for me, I'm saying this for you. And that is trying to create a buy-in. And for older adolescents, they have a more agreeable, open personality because they see things as flexible, they don't see it as conflictual, they're more likely to negotiate. You see higher levels of academic achievement, less, let's say, criminal problems like drug and alcohol abuse. And despite whatever problems they may have otherwise, they seem to have a positive adjustment to adulthood because they link adulthood with immaturity, and it's more of a continuum than a kind of a clear break, which is like, here I'm a child and I have to follow all the rules, and here I'm free and an adult and I get to make all the rules. They see this as that you talk to people. I mean, I think the best way to describe this is that you talk to teenagers as if they are adults, which means you talk to them with respect, you talk to them like they're on an equal playing field, and you don't make your power and authority that visible in the interaction. Why is it effective? It's a balance. It's a balance between having boundaries and allowing teenagers to have choice. And so what they're doing is they're allowing them to build up independence, and a key word here is autonomy, which means they can choose their own fate. And they become more self-reliant because, like, they're given choices. They are treated like that. They can have things explained to them. And they're allowed to basically, what they were asking for is buy-in by the teenagers to the rules and standards and boundaries that are set out. So it might be something like, okay, we have to have a curfew, but why don't you suggest what you think the curfew should be and maybe explain your reasons. And I think very often people are willing to accept an adverse decision as long as they think the decision was made fairly and consistently. So as a teacher, I've always found that people are willing to take an adverse decision about grading or class policies as long as they see it as not being a product of favoritism. If they see, like, well, this teacher favors one group of students against another group of students, they seem that as unjust. But they seem to be very accepting of very strict teachers and also very maybe permissive teachers, as long as they see that as a product of, like, say, a consistent process. And this enables interactions, discussion, and not necessarily explicit constraints. And this sets the stage for a strong attachment because arguably what happens, the parent or the adult becomes a friend and not just, let's say, an authority figure. So just some reports on, like, self-reliance. And here you see the authoritative parents developing the most self-reliance among adolescents, and indulgent parents actually lead to more self-reliance, and only to the extent that indulgent parents give you the support, but also encourage people to make their choices about what they want, while authoritarian parents and indifferent parents either don't provide a good model, or they basically make all the choices, and you're not going to be self-reliant if all you're doing is conforming and deference to authority. Authoritarian parents tend to do better, but here you see authoritarian parents as being the second best. Parents that are more demanding tend to get more academic production, while indulgent parents or indifferent parents, it's hard to care or work hard when your authority figure, when your parent doesn't seem to care, which means, like, you can have high grades, you have low grades, it doesn't matter. It really saps the motivation. School problems. Once again, you see a slightly different parent. The most school problems, indulgent parents, indifferent parents. I don't think there's anything surprising about that. Authoritarian parents perhaps lead to conflict and therefore more rejection of authority. So what beliefs are reflected in parenting styles? Research on child rearing tend that American parents American society, I think, values independence. And I experienced this because I once taught at a Japanese American high school where some of the children and some of the teachers were raised in America, and some of the teachers and some of the students were brought up in Japan. And then they would all go to the same college in Japan afterwards, and the common pattern was that the American students were not as good as far as being students. Their grade point averages were not as higher, they were not as achievement oriented, but the university's feedback was they really appreciated the students that came from American backgrounds because they were more independent, so they formed clubs and they helped organize a social life, and they really made the campus a better place for everyone because they had a lot more independence and initiative than the Japanese students who worked very hard, but worked very hard in like conventional and routine ways. And so that seems to be something that, in addition to getting good grades in a variety of different subjects, that the American system, both educationally and also the parenting system, tends to value this idea of social development and independent self-reliance as much as they promote, let's say, academic achievement. Authoritarian parenting discourages independence. Reflect the parents that most parents in the United States believe that it's good for adolescents and teenagers to learn to make their own decisions rather than follow what I want. So there are some other things going on than just, and most of these studies of parenting styles and teenagers are in situations where there are two parents and only one child. When you have different family situations, this can become more complex, which means adolescents basically raise their parents in this as much as parents sometimes raise their children, which means that parents learn from their children, and they learn from the types of challenges that children give different parents, whether you have a child with special needs, whether you have a child who is more independent, and that shapes how the parent develops. Like, parenting is not something that we all are descended from parents, but no one gets it right. It's kind of new, and people make mistakes along the way. I think that's probably the only universally true thing you can say about parenting. The other thing is that it gets more complex when you have more than one sibling, which means parents might raise one sibling one way in one parenting style and a second sibling in a different way. And some of this is because they overcorrect for what they did with their oldest child. So if they thought they were too authoritarian with their first child, or too pushy or too demanding, they might become very indulgent with their younger children. And you kind of see this, that older children tend to do better academically, while younger children tend to do better socially. And so what you can see is different parents might parent differently, and they might see a difference in how they treat one child versus the other. And I'm sure all of us who have siblings have always felt that perhaps our parents treat one of our siblings differently than they treat us. And that means that there isn't just one parenting style. There is one parenting style for parent-child pair, but there are more than one parent-child pairs when there are more than one sibling. So as I was saying, you can see differential parenting between different siblings. You can see things where different children can have different family environments, which means you can have a change in economic situations. You can have families who move. You can have, if you are a child of older parents or younger parents, which means parents are at a different age when they raise their oldest children than when they raise their youngest children. They might be younger and therefore able to be involved in more like sports activities when they're for their oldest children, but not be able to keep that up for their youngest children if they're spaced over a long period of time. Other cultures. Authoritarian parenting is very distinctive in Western cultures, particularly American culture. It is not as common in non-Western cultures. You tend to see a lot more authoritarian parenting. There's an expectation that there's a hierarchy and authorities to be obeyed, and there is no questioning. And there's an idea that the parent carries more authority than it does in Western cultures. Parents, you follow your parents because they're the parents. You don't really ask why. But this doesn't mean that traditional cultures or Asian and Latin cultures that are generally classified as being more authoritarian and their parenting styles are different. There was a whole string of research back in the 1950s that said that authoritarian parents cultivated fascism because they cultivate an obedience to authority among the general public in those countries. I think people have moved away from that, and I mean, to a large extent, I would say this is disproved, that the parenting style does not, in a sense, generate the general culture. But I think there's a greater acceptance of authority because authority comes with more obligations in other cultures than it does in the United States. While authority is kind of like seen as a right, like it's my right to do something, so I'm going to do it, and it's absolute. Most hierarchies particularly I can speak for Asia, means that you're supposed to follow your elders and show respect for them, but at the same time, there's a heavy obligation that they're supposed to take care of you, which means that if you fail a test, it's not your fault. It's your parents' fault. It's your teacher's fault, because they didn't take care of you and they didn't show you the right model. And that is in a very different way of thinking about it, which means when you fail a test, it's not because you failed and the authority can punish you. It's the authority failed to live up to their obligation or their role. And because there's an understanding and an expectation that people in authority are supposed to sacrifice themselves for the people they take care of or under their authority, much more than the United States, that people might be more accepting of that authority. Because it has an inherently limiting aspect to it. So the culture means that the same parenting style is actually different from culture to culture. So kind of as I was saying is that what demanding means is different in different cultures. And without going too much in, we'll talk more about culture in the next unit, but I think we can talk about the interplay between choices about parenting and also the culture that they occur in. So just to do two kind of traditional parenting styles, I think this is true. Child finds that white, meaning like European, misunderstand Asian American parenting, and therefore labels authoritarian. And as I said, I don't think they see as someone who's spent a lot of my life in East Asia, the tenderness in a lot of these relationships, which does not seem to always get portrayed or appreciated by people who are not part of that culture. We don't find that Asian adolescents or Asian American adolescents have the negative effects that we were showing before with authoritarian parenting, which means some of the things that we're talking about, the patterns in these different categories, does not seem, if we just look at Asian adolescents in isolation, do not see the same negative effects. And they seem to have the higher grades, lower behavior problems, lower rate of psychological problems, consistent with authoritative parenting. For Latino parents, once again, often classified as authoritarian, but I think that there's a strength of family, and I think some of you are from Latino families in this class, and I think that the idea of respect is different than obedience. Like you respect them, but it's an earned respect, and therefore it comes with a tenderness and appreciation of like the sacrifices that people make for you. So the respect is not just respect because they're your parent. It's a respect that comes from what they have done for you as a parent, and therefore the family, which is an effective zone in Latino families that maybe is not always seen in families from Western European backgrounds or Protestant backgrounds. United States. So authoritative parenting is less prevalent in some of these ethnic subcultures inside the United States than among, let's say, white cultures in the white Protestant European cultures in the United States. There are beneficial things. That being said, that doesn't mean you can import different cultural styles of parenting into every other subculture, which means you might not be able to import the Asian American model into African American or Hispanic families. They're whole systems, and you can't take them apart or like take one part out and transfer it to another. So you can't really graft one onto the other. But the point is that most of them have a balancing between their strengths and their weaknesses. That means that we need to maybe redefine what the four categories are when we're talking about the presence of certain subcultures. I think that an authoritarian parenting style seems to militate against political values such as liberty and freedom, and therefore it's hard to legitimize. An indulgent parent is seen like kind of a little bit of a feature of the American kind of work ethic. that indulgence is not seen as good parenting, it's seen as being bad parenting, born of affluence, unearned. And so I don't think that indulgent parenting, a parent who's indulgent, like, you see this thing where a rich person doesn't give any money to their children because they want them to earn it, rather than, let's say, have everything done for them. So adolescents who can, we can talk a little bit about closing, talking about attachment. Adolescents who are permitted to assert their own opinions, which means that even though they might not get the final say, they're allowed to express their views and their disagreements. They're going to have higher levels of self-esteem. They're going to be more able to cope. In some ways, they're getting, let's say, a safety zone practice on being an adult and learning to express themselves. While those who are not allowed to that, they feel rejected, and this leads to kind of even a rejection by the person themselves. They feel like their feelings are inadequate or not worthy of love because their parent who should be loving them is not accepting of that. And so the point is, like, they feel like they didn't earn the love of their parent, and therefore not only the parent is rejecting them, but they internalize their parents' reject onto themselves. And therefore they're going to feel less connected to their parents. They might feel like their parents are just the person who gave birth to me. Beyond that, they're not really